Hi everyone, welcome to the Reef Resilience webinar, Restoring Small-Scale Fisheries, Lessons in Collective Impact for Systematic Change. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Petra McGowan and I'm the Program Manager for the Nature Conservancy's Reef Resilience Program and your host for today's webinar. First, a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar is going to be around an hour. We're going to have about 45 minutes of presentations followed by question and answer. There's two ways that you can ask questions. You can use the question box at any time throughout the webinar to send questions, and we're going to keep track of those for the end of the presentation. Or you can raise your hand during the question portion of the webinar, and I can try to call on you at that time. You raise your hand by clicking on the small hand icon on the toolbar to the left of your name. If you're having any technical difficulties, such as trouble hearing or seeing the slides, you can send us a message via the chat box and we'll try to help you resolve that issue. So before I introduce our presenters, we'd like to give a quick poll for the participants just to give them an idea of who's on with us today. So the first question is, had you heard about 50 and 10 before seeing the information on this webinar? So you just give a simple yes or no. Were you familiar with 50 and 10? I'll give you a minute to put in your response. Okay, so a lot of you had heard of it, but there are some of you that are not familiar. So Megan and Corey, that'll be useful for you guys as you're talking. And then we have one more question. Did you attend the 50 and 10 convening that happened in Belize? This will help our presenters kind of also know how many people are up to speed on what's happening. So select if you attended the convening in Belize. Okay, so most of you did not. So great, thanks for sharing that information with us. And I'm now going to introduce and welcome our presenters for today. So Megan Arneson is the Acting Executive Director of 50 and 10. She was originally hired to help scale the organization, handle day-to-day operations, and support building the network. And after only a year on the job, she became the Acting Executive Director. At 50 and 10, she's worked to showcase what could have been possible with the right investment and structure from the start, by finishing what had been started with the organization and driving home the prototype projects, hosting the network convening in Belize for the 50 and 10 community. Her past experience includes work as an independent consultant, offering project management, facilitation, communications, operations support, and driving social and environmental programs, working with a range of both nonprofit and for-profit organizations. We also have Corey Pete, who will be presenting today. He is a program director for 50 and 10 and has worked to engage stakeholders and facilitate knowledge sharing about sustainable fisheries management, helped with the design and support of collaborative fishery restoration programs implemented by the 50 and 10 partners around the world. Previously, his work included defining certification standards and designing sustainability improvement programs for fisheries and aquaculture, and has worked with all elements of the supply chain from fishers to consumers. He has led projects for USAID and also worked with many different organizations over the years, including WWF, Environmental Defense, Seafood Watch, and many more. So we're very excited to have both presenters today, and thanks again for joining us. And I'm now going to pass it over to Megan to start out. Like I said, I'll be taking questions at the end of the presentations for both presenters. Megan, go ahead.
Thank you, Petra. And first, I just want to thank Reef Resilience Network for helping us pull this together. It's been great having such an awesome support team who sort of does all the back-end management of the webinar. But I also want to thank everyone who's on the call today. There was a lot of work that went into 50 and 10. Not only the convening that we're going to be really talking about today, but the entire initiative from the beginning. And it's really heartening to see the number of people that are on the call still interested in learning and exchanging. It's proof that this is the kind of conversation and collaborative learning that needs continued funding in the future. So anyway, let's start at the beginning. What is 50 and 10 and why are we here today? So 50 and 10 was an experimental network organization that was really unique in its focus. It combined a global perspective on ocean fisheries with a very significant focus on small-scale wild capture fisheries and a commitment to addressing social, economic, political, and environmental issues all at the same time. And the players in the network recognize the need for speed in this situation. It's urgent. We know we're in danger from overfishing, pollution, acidification, and while in the long run that's really bad from an environmental standpoint and certainly an economic one, from a food security standpoint this could be devastating much sooner than anyone is ready for. And we know that improving small-scale fisheries in the developing world is particularly important because they employ over 90% of the world's capture fishers and fish workers. They contribute to 50% of global catch, and they tend to be the most biodiverse. And yes, we know they're in poor shape, and that without intervention, they will continue to get worse. So over the past 4 years, 50 and 10 grew from this teeny tiny kernel of an idea to a sort of emerging consensus, to a really ambitious agenda, and finally a network organization that tried to lay the foundation for some really progressive ideas for how to scale restoration efforts in the world's small-scale marine fisheries. And we went out and identified prototype projects to test a certain way of working in an attempt to identify what works and scale those solutions across other fisheries that are in need of new ideas and intervention. So how did it start? Well, the seed for 50 and 10 was planted around 2011 when a group of fisheries experts, conservation NGOs, World Bank representatives, and several major philanthropies came together to start talking about what would it look like to achieve large-scale restoration. And the group decided that success absolutely requires addressing challenges using several levers of change at once and widening what was this exclusive focus on environmental benefits to start to embrace economic and social factors that would then in turn incentivize behavior change. So they enlisted individuals.
Sorry, Petra, sorry to interrupt. Your presentation is not showing in full screen mode. Could you switch it to maybe like full screen?
That was presenter mode. Let's try a different one.
Thank you.
How's that?
That's it. Perfect.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great.
Okay.
We'll move on. So they enlisted individuals from the seafood industry, finance sector, and other key actors to start to collectively identify where are the systemic failures in real-world fisheries and start to design solutions together. So out of these discussions came this idea of a sort of global fisheries lab that would pool capacities and expertise and test the promising tools and strategies in specific fisheries. And that idea really took hold in 2012 at the Economist World Ocean Summit, where the former president of the World Bank laid down this challenge. He said, the global community has the resources and the knowledge to restore 50% of the world's fisheries within 10 years if all the players work together. So the vision was an organization that would develop and share knowledge and then replicate the most effective tools and approaches worldwide. And everyone agreed that success, again, would require taking this whole systems approach. So it was from that thinking that 50 and 10, as this experimental initiative, was born, and really soon thereafter the group began drafting its theory of change. So the theory of change describes an approach that includes all the players in the system, right? The fishers, their communities, buyers, investors, governments, the entire ocean ecosystem. And it posits that when the four levers of change, community empowerment, policy reform, market demand, and credible science, are all working in concert, the result is sustainable recovery in a much shorter period of time than would otherwise be possible, with widespread environmental, economic, and social benefits. So in essence, that translates to more food, more stable jobs, more prosperous businesses, and healthier oceans. And who's arguing with that? So if we could identify specific fisheries to prototype and prove that this approach works in certain environments, then we could replicate the solutions and scale restoration practices at a pace that might just allow us to avert the kinds of food security disasters that we're being warned about. So the question I often get when we get to this overall infographic is about what is this piece in the middle? What does collective impact actually mean? And from the very beginning, the 50 and 10 partners recognized that social problems and their solutions come from the interaction of lots of different organizations within a larger system. And achieving lasting change at scale requires alignment across sectors. It requires active coordination. It requires sharing all these lessons among government, nonprofits, businesses, philanthropies, and ensuring that all these groups are working toward the same goals and measuring the same things. So collective impact refers to a framework that was designed to help groups tackle these kinds of really complex and deeply entrenched social problems. And it provides a structure for helping make collaboration work across all those different stakeholder groups and across sectors. And there are 5 key elements to the approach, and it really requires agreeing on a common agenda, shared ways to measure success, mutually reinforcing activities between groups, in other words, making sure that you're leveraging each other's strengths, a cycle of continuous communication, and some sort of backbone support structure. So the idea is, in practice, 50 and 10 would provide a backbone support system as a sort of neutral facilitator and repository for knowledge, while bringing the partners together to agree on a common agenda, shared measurement goals, and mutually reinforcing activities. And it really worked hard to try to provide this cycle of communication, both within and across projects. And it's really come a long way from its beginnings in that area to the culminating event, which was this network convening in Belize in January. And I'll dive into the details of that in just a second, but looking at all of this, it looks awesome. It all sounds great. But I feel like before we dive into the results of the convening, which was that sort of ultimate feedback loop in the effort of continuous communication, I should explain just a little bit about what happened and why 50 and 10 is not continuing. So, as I said earlier, this was concocted as sort of a grand experiment, and even with all the right ideas and guiding principles in place, there's absolutely no guarantee that you can bring a bunch of potentially competing organizations into a room and get them to play nicely together, especially because we had some major hurdles to overcome. Starting with funding. 50 and 10 was hamstrung at the outset by funding issues. And it was really unfortunate that 2 of the funders who came to the table at the beginning ended up going through some major internal restructuring and had to pull out. So the network was left to start with literally only about 1/3 of the funds that it had originally planned for. Luckily, the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation were totally committed to the idea and didn't want to back down even after some of their partners left. But having significantly fewer resources to start was a huge setback, and the effects of that tended to snowball. One of the critical success factors defined by the collective impact is the idea of multi-year funding from the outset for the backbone organization. Timing was also an issue. So based on having significantly fewer resources and only 18 months of funding to start, which, by the way, was later renewed for another year, and we've even stretched that out for an additional few months to get us to where we are today. The expectations for showing results in that amount of time are unrealistic. Many of you are all too familiar with the 1 to 2 year grant cycle, and we know that that's not enough for anyone to show significant change, not in terms of environmental benefit and certainly not in terms of behavior change. And so there was no way to legitimately start and scale a program that would prove that the 50 and 10 theory of change works in the field in only 18 months. And then to have the added responsibility of continuously communicating about that program with so few resources and in such a short time period was equally unrealistic. And as any of you who've ever been in charge of building a team before know, it's impossible to attract, hire, train, and keep the kind of talent necessary to scale a program like that in that little amount of time. And then, of course, we have the issue of expectations. So members came to the table expecting from the beginning this sort of big pot of money to incentivize them to work together and essentially circumvent the competition for funding for this kind of work. They were expecting lots of other players at the table, including the seafood industry, who were involved at the beginning, but when it came down to it, the industry players were just too busy to invest their time in this kind of wild experiment. They were also expecting 50 and 10 to be many different things. Certainly to play too many roles for a staff of only 1 to 2 people. Some really wanted it to simply funnel money to projects on the ground that fit the criteria. Simple. Or to function as a sort of PR machine to help them shine the light on their own work that fit the criteria. Others wanted 50 and 10 to serve more like a general contractor or a matchmaker, connecting the project funders with the project implementers. And then still others wanted more of a learning initiative that would be focused on case studies, webinars, and trainings. And 50 and 10 tried on all these different hats, all these different approaches, but never really got to the point where it was clear to everyone involved exactly what its role should be. And, you know, there's this saying about trying to be everything to everyone, and it never works. And in the midst of that confusion, it became really difficult to attract any new participants. So before the work with the featured prototypes really kicked off, 50 and 10 was at a point where it was basically a website and an inner circle of NGOs. A lot of talk, but not a lot of action. However, once that prototype work really kicked off, which of course took a lot longer than anyone anticipated, we remember that change takes a long time, suddenly there was something to talk about. But it was a little bit too late at that point to revive the interest of many of those original players. Despite all this, we continued to strive forward in an effort to realize the vision, right? We sought multi-year funding, which we hoped would enable us to grow and maintain the network, coordinate more collaborative projects, provide catalytic support to more prototypes, and ensure the spread of successful approaches to restoring fisheries. But around August 2015, it became really clear that we weren't going to get the internal or the external support that we would need to keep going, even with a more focused approach to engaging and providing tools and support directly to the on-the-ground practitioners who appear to be the ones who had the most to gain from the 50 and 10 approach. So we made a commitment, I made a commitment, to finish out the work with those featured prototypes and design and host a network convening to to give those folks an opportunity to exchange lessons learned, communicate about their learnings with the wider community in order to save time, help avoid pitfalls in the future, and share what worked. So we could make this whole webinar about the story of 50 and 10 and the pitfalls to look out for in creating social change initiatives, but that's not the ultimate goal. That's not really why we're here. This story is really just to provide the backdrop for the learnings and realizations that came out of the convening and the recommendations for what needs to happen next without the 50 and 10 backbone to keep driving this work forward. And I just have to say there was so much potential here, and it's really a shame that we didn't get to do everything that we set out to do. But all things considered, the network members still did accomplish quite a lot in only a few years, and they're continuing their own work. So aside from the challenges that we faced, I really believe that the organizations who were part of the network really remain strongly committed to this collective vision of making fisheries the sustainability success story of the 21st century. And despite facing those hurdles that we just mentioned, they've continued making meaningful progress on spreading this whole system approach to restoring fisheries. They've started their own new collaborations. They've developed new tools. They've prototyped fishing systems that are really delivering on those social, economic, and environmental metrics that we've all agreed are so important. So there were some big accomplishments, and the first major accomplishment was the theory of change, which we went through at a kind of a high level already. And if you're interested in diving deeper, you can find the theory of change document on our website. And by the way, the website will stay live for the next 2 years, so all the resources will continue to be housed there for your reference, at least in the short term, and maybe in a couple of other places as well. We also completed some significant work on what we called impact initiatives, or thematic projects around finance, traceability, and starting to expand our understanding of the real status of global fish stocks. You can find the finance framework and the MFISH reports on the website as well. And one of the most impactful accomplishments was this prototypes program. So 50 and 10 really set out to test our theory and way of working through a set of projects that were selected from 17 different project nominations by the network. And these would be the most likely to allow for rapid learning, refinement, and application to other fishery rebuilding efforts. So again, based on an extremely limited time frame, we had to embrace an approach that really emphasized their readiness for growth and replication, and that included elements like sort of an already existing supportive political environment, a certain level of existing understanding and cooperation amongst stakeholders, sufficient scientific information, and the existence of some kind of market support to help drive forward sustainability. So 50 and 10 featured prototypes were the top handful of projects at different stages in the project life cycle that have been identified as the most likely to make really substantial progress quickly. So the time frame that we're talking about is 6 to 9 months, and we've already established that that's problematic. But we did our best to make it work, and with some limited but very strategic program support from the 50 and 10 core team. And 2 of these featured prototypes also received a small matching grant by 50 and 10 to help them carry out the activities specifically related to testing the 50 and 10 theory of change. In total, there were 3 of these, what we called featured prototypes, and unfortunately, we don't have time to go into these in detail, but again, if you're interested, you can find the case studies on our website. They're currently under the news section, but we'll add links later to the online forum that we're going to talk about after this. And there will be some nicer PDF versions that will be available very soon through Reef Resilience Network. So the first featured prototype was the Belize lobster and conch fishery. And like I said, you can read all about the details of this in the case study, but just a high-level overview of why we engaged the way we did. Well, so we didn't give the partners in Belize a catalytic grant to help move their project forward in a major way. We did choose this project because it was the most developed in terms of alignment of stakeholders, access to funding, credible science, and market access at the time when we launched the prototypes program. And it already had 4 of our NGO partners involved at the ground level. So we showcased the Belize lobster and conch fishery managed access program as the featured example of what a good prototype design might aspire to look like. And we did provide them some support in other ways by offering technical assistance and introductions, helping foster the collaboration between the NGOs and government, and co-sponsoring a market analysis that gave the partnership some critical information on how to access potential high-value markets. And Belize was really the quintessential prototype example because it was already at a point where it was very effectively addressing all 4 levers of change. There were years of data collection already in hand. The government and the fisheries department were already on board, really willing, ready, and eager to partner with NGOs. They'd been working on a community engagement program and starting to include fishers in data collection and decision-making activities pretty early. And this was even enhanced by hiring community engagement liaisons later who were trained by RARE. And they already had a thriving export market and growing local interest in sustainably sourced seafood. And the pilot program was just at the point of being ready to expand and scale. So the other 2 were South Africa and Vietnam. And based on extremely limited funding and capacity, sorry that's such a theme, like I mentioned earlier, we could only pick 2 of these projects to fund for what I at the time was hoping would be just the first cohort in a long line of projects that 50 and 10 would support over the long term. Nonetheless, they were extremely successful given the circumstances, and they're a great example of what might be possible given more funding and more time in the future. And I should emphasize that these projects are both continuing, and they're utilizing whatever other sources of funding that they can get their hands on. So South Africa was this restaurant value chain project, and with 50 and 10's grant money, WWF South Africa was able to develop and begin implementing a value chain pilot project that was intended to improve the co-management of the fishery and provide tangible benefits to the fisher folk by creating a local market of restaurants and a grocery chain for sustainably caught fish that would be purchased through a new women's fisher cooperative. And in terms of the levers, they're just beginning to get the fishers and the processors organized in this really early stage pilot project, but they've set up a direct supply chain, and they're demonstrating how other communities might implement this new policy designed to help overcome the disenfranchisement of small-scale fishers in South Africa. In Vietnam, in the blue swimming crab fishery, our grant funding went toward a bioeconomic study as well as multiple stakeholder trainings to engage the fishing community, the local government, and supply chain stakeholders in a transition, again, to a rights-based co-management system. And the pilot was extremely successful in getting buy-in from the fishing community, helping new government standards for reporting, and getting agreement from the middlemen to stop purchasing undersized crabs. So there's definitely a need to continue this kind of support for their engagement there. As you can imagine, the policy environment is extremely challenging in Vietnam, and some additional science would be useful to help make the case. One real challenge is that the export market there is a key demand driver, and the value of the system change is not inherently clear to a lot of the processors, who will likely end up with increased operation costs. So again, we could do an entire webinar on each of these. So if you're hungry for more, please go to the case studies. And if you need more than that, we're always happy to make introductions to the practitioners who work in these particular fisheries. So don't hesitate to reach out. And of course, there was so much more that we could have done, wanted to do with all the prototype projects. Not only provide multi-year support for those that we did feature and help push them to the finish line, but also especially additional support in terms of time, communications, and matchmaking for the ones that didn't get chosen for funding, for those other 14 projects that were submitted. But again, given our capacity, it just turned out to be impossible. So the final accomplishment, now we get to the good stuff, was the network convening in Belize. So about a year and a half ago, we started talking about the need for a network convening. And the idea was that we would use this opportunity to bring the network players together, share the progress from the prototypes, examine what worked and didn't work, but also that it would be an opportunity to re-engage the network, inspire new action, new collaborations, priorities for the future, and hopefully attract new network members so that we could continue to grow. Well, all that still held true when the time came, except for the part about attracting new network members at this point, as you can imagine. But as the parting gift to the community, we wanted to offer this unique opportunity to share the progress made up until now, celebrate those lessons learned, have some real conversations about what does and doesn't work, both in the field and at the systems level, help our practitioners identify new potential partnerships, and create a list of tools and processes that would be needed to make further progress, and have a frank conversation about this piece that just seems to keep eluding everyone, which is specifically in small-scale fisheries, how to scale and spread the solutions that work in one area across other small-scale fisheries in other regions or at other points in their development or readiness. And I think we did set up the right conditions for everyone to feel comfortable having those conversations candidly. So we already talked about Belize as being a prime example of all four levers of the theory and change of action, so why not showcase it as the backdrop for a meeting that brings together all the network practitioners? So last month, we brought together just over 30 of our closest partners. Unfortunately, there are a few people missing from this photo, but it included the representatives from the prototypes in Belize, South Africa, and Vietnam, as well as some others, to take advantage of this unique opportunity for a face-to-face meeting. And the group was intentionally small, as we really wanted to foster a safe space to exchange lessons and innovate. So over the course of 2.5 days, we delved into all 3 prototype examples. We went and visited the fisheries co-ops in Belize for an immersive experience of the supply chain there. We explored several different models for financing the transition to sustainability, and we explored some of the key challenges and barriers, brainstormed ideas for overcoming those, and then built on the best ideas collaboratively. And as a result, there was a really clear feeling, again, that this conversation was a unique opportunity, that more conversations of this kind are needed, that other projects around the world would absolutely benefit from this kind of cross-cultural learning exchange, that a neutral party is really important to facilitate these kinds of conversations. And last, but obviously not least, that more funding is needed to continue this kind of work. So while the experiment called 50 and 10 has reached a stopping place, I think we can all appreciate that the work is far from done. And while 50 and 10 as a backbone entity won't be here any longer as a support mechanism, we have identified some concrete ways for the legacy to live on. So at this point, I'm going to let Corey take over and dive into these 4 core areas that the group agreed were top priorities for further development, and then he'll get into some of the solutions and the recommendations that we have for making some of these happen.
Great. Thanks, Megan, and thanks everybody who's participating today. From my own part, I really feel like I got to jump on the bandwagon at the very end when all the hard work had really been done, and just got to sort of bask in the results of 50 and 10. So it's been very nice and informative for me, and I certainly thank 50 and 10 and Megan for the opportunity. And as she mentioned, the Belize convening was, I guess, in some ways the crowning event for the 50 and 10 project, and from the poll it looks like most of you were not part of that. And so just to give you a bit of a picture, I mean, those of you who kind of work in this space know that there's quite a bit of passion from the people who work in this space, and when you get them all in a room trying to talk about something as complex as fisheries improvement, it can get crazy really fast, just in terms of keeping everybody on track with tasks and everything. So, in large part due to the facilitation we had, we were able to sort of, force a group of passionate people to kind of really get to the nitty-gritty. And as Megan said, this is where these 4 pieces came out. So I'm going to just try to walk you through each one of them quickly, and you'll kind of see that they all sort of wrap up into one thing at the end anyways. So we'll start with compliance and enforcement. And basically, for this one, the problem statement is obviously that there's this challenge of trying to transition from open access to managed access, which obviously is really critical for any kind of long-term fisheries improvement. And this seems to be getting more and more attention. We're starting to see various things happen around the world. My favorite example is the Indonesian fisheries minister. She owns an airline in Indonesia before she got into politics and saw all the illegal fishing that was happening in Indonesia. So when she took the post, she decided that they were going to implement a policy to tell foreign fishers, if you come in our waters, we will arrest you and we will blow up your boat. And they've since blown up in about a year and a half, probably dozens, if not hundreds of boats. So obviously that's an extreme example, but it just shows the levels that some are going to deal with this problem. So if we look at the challenges here, then the challenges of this are basically to how do we promote fair and unimpeded enforcement, and most importantly, how do we get greater transparency, greater eyes on the system itself? We need to convey a better understanding, both to players on the inside and as well as those on the outside, to sort of understand how it all works. And this, as you can appreciate, is particularly important when you're starting to look at the challenges of investing in fisheries, which I'll talk more about in a minute. So, thinking about what are core indicators and just bringing greater transparency. So we had a group on this, and basically some of the next steps that we were exploring were basically that this discussion, needs to include others. The discussion we had was mostly Belize focused, and obviously there's lots of really interesting things going on in Belize. But when you're dealing with governments, there's obviously going to be many different realities in many different places. So broadening the discussion into a more, ideally more neutral form would be really important to help share ideas and continue the conversation. So for community engagement, similarly, the reality right now is that in most places, or in a lot of places, there's a reality that communities generally don't trust the fisheries management authorities, and in some, if not many cases, they don't necessarily trust the conservation organizations where they work. Now, there's obviously exceptions to this. RARES does a lot of really interesting work, and TNC and others, but generally this is a problem, especially when you're thinking about how do you move these improvement programs to scale. How do you build the foundations in at the bottom to really foster improvement? Because it's one thing to be forced to improve. Anybody can tell you what to do, but it's another thing to understand and embrace why that needs to happen. So again, some of the challenges here are that communication is a problem, understanding each other's reality, and just making sure that there's really meaningful and effective communications when you're engaging communities. Obviously, there's a lot of knowledge sharing that could happen here, many different communities around the world that would need to be engaged. So one of the next steps here was, if the second next step on the slide is develop a white paper with guidelines for improved community engagement might be one way. But again, we need some sort of neutral platform, and you see the acronym AFA here, and I'll just say that stands for Artisanal Fisheries Finance Accelerator, and I'm going to tell you all about that in just a minute. But this might be a platform, a neutral platform that might help this kind of discussion on the community engagement side, and also the enforcement piece that I started with. So over to data and data management and collection. Again, it goes without saying that a lack of good and consistent data is critical. We need to make sure that fisheries managers and authorities are able to make the right decisions, and so having this in place is pretty important. The challenge here, of course, is that there are differences in how people collect information about fisheries. What are they using that information for, and on what scale are they collecting it at? So some are collecting it at the site level, some might be collecting it at the country level or region, etc. So there's a couple problems. One is that how do we standardize this so that we're sort of maximizing people's efforts who are spending time and money to go out there to do this? And then second, we are headed towards a world of online access to tools and things. How could we build an online repository where some of this data might go? Now, there's lots of sensitivities around data, and that varies by countries. It's way easier said than done. But certainly from just a perspective of showing people what data to collect and giving them options to feedback on how they can improve or do better is certainly a need. So again, for the next steps on this side, this activity, it's looking more under this AFA platform. So let me just go straight then to what is AFA. So this falls under the sustainable finance piece, and at the Belize convening, it was very clear that there was lots of energy around this sustainable finance piece. For those of you who may be familiar with a document that 50 and 10 put together called Towards Investing in Sustainable Fisheries, which is on our website, there's a quote in there that basically says, while the scale of fisheries improvement is immense, so is the amount of capital available to support that improvement if the right structures can be put in place. So at the convening, it was clear that there's definitely examples of this. We had a private Swiss company there talking about what they had tried to do. We had a couple NGOs talking about their programs, a couple of funds that were talking about their programs, but it's clear that everybody is more or less at the beginning, and we're still struggling, if that's the right word, to find that first real success story. And part of the reason is that there is this large knowledge gap between small-scale fisheries improvers, if you want to call them that, and then the private investment world. And we really need to find a way to bridge that gap to have that learning landscape across the sectors. So the vision for AFA, as I mentioned, is called the Artisanal Fisheries Finance Accelerator. It needs to be a neutral convening platform that would bring together these financial and fisheries improvement experts to kind of exchange learning in a pre-competitive way and create/host tools for project developers. And really the goal here is how might we create the enabling environment for conditions for investable and scalable financing for small-scale fisheries. So just a couple quick key points. As I mentioned, it needs to be a pre-competitive platform. It really needs to be brand neutral. This needs to be something that everybody can come to, and it's not under one private sector or one NGO umbrella. And as I mentioned, you know, a clearinghouse of ideas and information where people can come with multiple needs and ideally take the tools away that they need, but also sort of drive not just a discussion but actions on, you know, active feedback on existing projects. How do we do this to get this result, etc. Just having that platform where everybody can come together. So some of the organizations that were part of the convening and/or part of the follow-up calls are listed here, and basically, you know, this is just an idea at this phase. We're certainly trying to see if this can ultimately be the baby of 50 and 10, if you want to call it that. And we will be exploring the idea further next week on a call with some of the folks that were at the convening. So just to summarize this a little bit, I mean, it's the reason that AFA got a lot of attention is it's really needed to bring, you know, the desires of investors and the realities of the fishing industry together in some way. I mean, for those of you who end up going to these different seafood events, these investor folks are coming. They're there. There's panels about them, but everybody is just so busy that it's difficult to get everybody around the same table and think critically. So that's really where we see the value of this platform. And all these pieces that we talked about, compliance and enforcement, data collection, protocols and storage, and appropriate community engagement, could all sort of be sub-activities or categories under this platform, all sort of set up with the aim of accelerating finance or investment into fisheries improvement, which, you know, there's no shortage of opportunities to do that. It's just a matter of well, I shouldn't say it's just a matter of, but you know, we need to figure out that formula and then get it applied as quickly as we can. So my last slide is really just on the different kinds of resources that kind of came out of the convening and as well as just our own experience in 50 and 10. And you know, we would suggest that this third-party facilitator role to design and manage and support these conversations was really critical. The Belize convening wasn't the only one that we did, and the reality is that everybody's busy. Everybody has their own organizational, strategic priorities that are taking place on a daily basis, and you know, sometimes it helps to just have someone create a space where you can come and just talk about your work and learn from others and really find ways forward. And in addition, you know, these online repository of resources for multiple purposes is a really important and need. And it, again, as I mentioned before, it seems only inevitable that there's going to be, you know, the equivalent of Facebook for fisheries or something like that. I mean, I know that, you know, shrimp farmers already do this in Thailand with their own social media. So something along those lines is really needed for people to come and learn and have as easy of access to resources as possible. And then Megan already talked about this, so just this need for multi-year funding and a better appreciation. So yeah, so that's all for me. I mean, bottom line here is that, you know, I think one of the things that 50 and 10 was able to demonstrate is that there's real value in these kind of bottom-up conversations, and maybe one thing that's been underestimated to date is the value of sort of letting people figure out how to do this and sort of instead of maybe telling them how to do it. So that's all I'll say for now.
Thanks so much, Corey. So just a note on the resources. As I mentioned, the 50 and 10 website will be live for the next 2 years, so any of the documents that we've mentioned thus far can be found there. Petra is also going to talk a little bit about this sort of follow-up forum that's going to happen, hosted by Reef Resilience Network, where we can continue Q&A after we do some live Q&A right now. But before we go there, I just wanted to say thank you again to everyone for attending. We really hope that this is a worthwhile use of your time this afternoon. Thanks very much again to Reef Resilience Network, Petra and Sherry, for your partnership and your support. Thank you, Corey, for jumping in and really helping us wrap up this project right and put this learning out to the community. And finally, many, many thanks to the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation for providing the funding for the 50 and 10 backbone operations and the funding to put on the convening as well as the webinar.
Great. Well, thank you both for the presentations, and I now want to open up the Q&A portion of the webinar. So remember, you can either send questions through the question box or raise your hand, and I will call on you. So now you can do that, and Megan and Corey will be able to answer questions. Mm-hmm.
Do you have some instructions at this point about how to get into that online forum later, or do you want to wait until we're done with Q&A?
Yeah, I usually do it right at the end of the questions, but we can
okay.
Yeah.
Make them wait.
Yeah, I can show them in a second, but
okay.
I just wanted to make sure that if anybody had any burning questions, we could get to those. So one of the questions that has come in is, you know, you were, because there was so much to cover in this presentation, you did mention some of those prototype projects, and specifically the South Africa project where they engaged restaurants, and you mentioned that they were engaging them to buy from a local women's co-op. And the question was, do you know what the incentive was for those restaurants to buy local? Do you know how they were, what were the incentives that were encouraging them? Why did they want to do that? Do you know?
Yeah, so these were I mean, this was a tiny pilot project, right? So there were 2 restaurants that they engaged that were pretty well-known, higher-end restaurants that catered to tourists who were sort of already in that space, right? They were already looking for local, they already source organic, and it was actually hard for them to find local fresh seafood. So it turned out to be a perfect partnership. But like I said, this was just starting out really, really small with a handful of fishers and this women-owned cooperative, which is super cool, that just got sort of started alongside of that, and it turned out to be a great symbiotic relationship.
Okay, thanks. So we have another question here. Based on your experience and any of the feedback from 50 and 10 members, if there were sufficient resources in the future, do you think that the 50 and 10 model could be successful?
Yeah, I absolutely do. And you know, it's like we've so it was a great experiment, right? It's not continuing, but I think we have really fleshed out those pieces that didn't work. We understand why they didn't work, and if we were to start something like it in the future, say an AFA model, that was very similar, I think we could avoid a lot of that. That's not to say that it would be perfect. Certainly, you know, anytime you start a new organization, you're gonna learn new things about what does and doesn't work. But I think some of those critical success factors we have identified and figured out how we could potentially overcome or circumvent them in the future.
Okay. For the audience that normally attends the Reef Resilience webinars, the marine managers in coral reef areas and stuff, what are key lessons that you recommend from the 50 and 10 work that they might be able to start being aware of or using in their work?
You know, Corey might have another answer for this as well, but for me, it's all about, you know, trying this this collective impact piece out, where we're really trying to expand our view, going from this really sort of focused emphasis on the environment to making sure that you're really paying attention to the community, to sort of the local political environment, and making sure that the right incentives are in place to change behavior. And I feel like that's applicable to, you know, anything. I mean, we could talk about farming in that vein as well.
Yeah, I mean, just to add a little bit, I mean, basically the lesson learned from my view is that, you know, 50 and 10 really, in my biased opinion, kind of really nailed the theory of change and sort of, to me, forces a conversation about any active fishery or, you know, or really any kind of improvement project where, you know, are you sure that you've really looked at all of the different levers that you might be able to push or pull to help create the change you want to see? And or, you know, it helps sort of get at this question of what is responsible improvement, right? So it's one thing for someone with millions of dollars to come in and just say, we're going to push this specific agenda. But the reality is this is about building things into the foundation, right? If it's sort of what I've said in one of my parts about, you know, anybody can tell somebody what to do, but, you know, if you can help them understand why they need to do it, or work with them to help come up with the solution, it just seems obvious that that's a much more long-lasting approach than, you know, and I'm not trying to be critical, it's just than what is some of the work and that's been gone on today. It's the natural evolution of how we all do this, and we all want to start with simple answers, and unfortunately there aren't any.
Okay. Yeah, and building on that with, you know, simple answers, I think there's space for us all to be a little bit more accepting of failure. I mean, how do you learn unless you've tried something and, you know, and fail? That's, you know, that's how we all learn when we're little kids, right? Nobody's expecting you to be perfect, and I think there's a lot of avoidance in the conservation community around messing anything up, because it'll really sort of screw up your chances for getting funded in the future, and so maybe that goes back to sort of, you know, re-educating funders around being a little bit more tolerant of being experimental and knowing that not everything that you try is going to work, but that you know, the more we do try, the more we learn, the faster we grow.
Great. Okay, well, I've got a couple more questions coming in, and I wanted to, I know you guys were willing to stay on and answer some more questions. I wanted to let people know, in case they needed to drop off, how to access you guys for more questions if they have any later, or if they feel like people couldn't attend the webinar. So, but then I know you guys are willing to stay on, because I do have a couple other questions that I want to ask you. So just in case anybody needs to drop off right now, we wanted to let you guys know that you will be able to continue this conversation on the Reef Resilience Network forum. There is going to be, if you're not already a forum member, you can go to reefresilience.org and register for the forum, and you just submit a simple registration form, and then we'll approve you. And once you're approved, there's a group titled Small Scale Fisheries Group, and then Megan and Corey will be answering questions there, and it's a space for you guys to continue this conversation and sharing over as long as you guys need that space. So I wanted to make sure that people were aware of that option. And it's a forum that's, the reason you do registration is that it is a private forum for managers and experts that support managers. So, but I wanted to ask you guys a couple more questions that are coming in. So Alan White has got a couple here. Curious if you've coordinated with the Too Big to Ignore project on small-scale fisheries based in Canada. Are you guys aware of that project?
Yeah, definitely aware. And I feel like they have a really good model. We didn't learn about them right from the beginning, which I think is another sort of issue in this industry. It's just so hard to keep track of what everybody's doing. So I was really excited to sort of learn a little bit more about them, but never got a formal introduction, and found that it took a little while to sort of get them to respond when I wanted to join their forum. So I definitely think there are some additional conversations that could be had about sort of what we've learned and that might be useful to them. And I'd be open to an introduction, or I can reach out to them again on my own if but yeah, Alan, if you're suggesting that, we will take you up on that suggestion.
And also, one of the viewers asked, the recording of this whole presentation will be sent out to the Reef Resilience email list, and if you're not a member of that list, it's easy to register. You can just email it resilience@tnc.org, and we can also send out the link to those of you that registered for this webinar, so that you can so there is a recording available if you missed any of the presentation or want to share it, and we will get that out to people. So another question here, are you guys going to document in detail where things failed and why? Are there any approach tools that could be generated from this work?
Yeah, so we just, you may have seen the link in the reminder email. We just published our white paper with findings from the convening, and some of those sort of what worked, what didn't work ideas are in there. In addition, I am trying to, in the next 4 days, finish up a document that puts forth those recommendations as well. No promises on exactly when that's going to be finished, but we would like to publish that as well, because I think it's definitely worth sharing for anyone who is interested in trying to start a collective impact initiative in this space, so that people aren't, making the same mistakes, and that they understand what, the pieces that did work, and how to replicate those.
Yeah. Okay, just a couple more questions before we close out the webinar. In Belize and other areas, how are fisheries management systems dealing with too many small-scale fishers who depend almost entirely on their fishing for livelihoods? This is typical of many developing countries.
Mm-hmm. Corey, do you want to take that one?
Sorry, my internet is a little bit dodgy. I didn't quite catch all of that.
Sure, I'll repeat it, Corey. In Belize and other areas, how are fisheries management systems dealing with the issue of just too many small-scale fishers who depend almost entirely on the fishing for livelihood? This is also typical in many developing countries.
Yeah, well, I think in some ways you might argue that they're not, and that's why something like 50 and 10, or at least the approach that it offers, is necessary. I mean, again, this is part of what I was able to learn. For example, in the South African prototype, they passed some sort of legislation, and I never had a chance to kind of look over it or get to understand it in really in depth. One of the things I understood from it was about enabling these different kinds of cooperatives. So, which is where this women's cooperative came from, and which led then to the establishment of the restaurant program, etc., with the help of WWF South Africa. So I think, I would say that it's uncertain if there's any like consistent approaches. It may be that there can't be, but as you can hear, I don't have the answers, and I'm not sure that they're out there yet. For example, the FAO just recently, like within the last year or two, published these guidelines for small-scale fisheries. It's titled something else, but the point is I think that's where we are. We're here trying to figure out how do we work more directly and foster these improvements. I think we saw in Belize that there's an interesting example there of working with small-scale fisheries around a managed access program, but that's in Belize. Does that work in a place like Indonesia or somewhere else? So lots of learning and conversations to be had. And again, this is where I think this fisheries investment piece becomes this potentially game-changing, carrot, if you will, to really encourage that conversation and get governments to help, build and enforce structures around small-scale fisheries management, so that the reported dollars that are available there can flow in to help support those improvements.
Oh, and just to add to that just a little bit and get a little bit more specific about Belize, in Belize, one of the things that some of the partners there are working on, and I can't remember who was the lead, if it was TNC or WCS, they were working on creating some alternative livelihoods programs. And one of the things that people mentioned to me about that they found really problematic was that they would get really limited funding for these alternative livelihoods programs, and so they would teach somebody a new skill or whatever and sort of turn them out and hope that they could do something with it, and then the funding would end and the project would fall apart and people went back to illegally fishing. So again, that brings us back to this question of long-term planning, multi-year funding.
All right, so I think we have time for one more question before we wrap it up today, and we might need to clarify, but the question is, what was the selection process for the fishers? And is it better to have groups apply for support that already have the critical members involved to demonstrate their commitment to success? I wonder if they meant the fisher prototype projects. But did that question make sense, or do you want to further clarify it?
I think the question is about what was the procedure for choosing the prototypes. Mm-hmm. And we basically created a scoring matrix that looked at a bunch of different indicators and tried to figure out, what are they doing already? What actions are already sort of taking place in terms of the 4 levers of change, right? How are they doing on community empowerment? What's going on in finance and markets? What's the status of their data? Is there credible science that we can rely on to make decisions? That sort of thing. But also we looked at them in terms of how the 5 critical success factors in the collective impact model were applied. And so basically it's about, is there a common agenda? What kind of mechanisms are in place to start talking about shared management? Are there coordinated activities already happening on the ground? What kinds of tools do you have in place for continuous communication? And then sort of tried to figure out across all the programs which ones were the furthest developed and most in need of some, that could really put to use a small amount of grant funding. Like some of these guys, like the Belize project was already so well funded, the $25,000 wasn't really going to do a lot, right? But in South Africa, $25,000 allowed them to hire an on-the-ground coordinator who could work really closely with the fishers, with the women's co-op, and with the restaurants, and sort of like be this go-between person. So the idea was to see how far we could push our money, and where were the critical gaps that needed filling that we had the capacity to help fill. So basically it was about giving them a little bit of money and a lot of hand-holding and pushing in certain areas to try to sort of raise their scores across the bar. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I
hope
think so.
Okay.
Well, I want to thank you both again for joining us and for your great presentations and really frank discussion about this project and the results and how people might be able to use it going forward. So as I mentioned, the recording of the webinar is going to be sent out tomorrow sometime. And we're always looking for suggestions on webinar topics, so you can email us at resilience@tnc.org if you have topics that you think are hot topics for coral reef fisheries and coral reef managers around the world, and we can explore hosting webinars on those. And again, please consider joining the forum to continue this dialogue and keep connecting on this important topic. So thanks again, Megan and Corey, and thanks everyone for participating.
Yeah, thank you. And just on the forum topic, I think we're pretty excited to continue the conversation. So, anything that you want to ask there, go ahead and do it, and we'll do our best to respond in a timely manner over the next few days.
Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.